This Chapter 1 provides a roadmap that summarizes the S&P methodology and prepares you for the more detailed and very technical discussion that follows in the remaining 5 chapters. Given the complexity and global reach of many banking institutions rated by S&P, it is not surprising that the rating methodology for this sector is far more detailed, technical, and nuanced than for most other industries. S&P faces a number of challenges in its attempts to formulate guidelines that are detailed enough to address every principal ratings factor relevant to the banking industry without becoming overwhelming. These challenges include the following: the extraordinary complexity of the largest banking institutions and the tremendous variety of business models followed by different institutions. The differences in emphasis on the retail versus corporate sector, domestic versus international markets, commercial versus investment banking, and extent of customer-driven versus proprietary trading activities, among many others. The differences between how banks report their principal financial data under accounting versus regulatory standards. The differences in how national regulators determine risk weights for various exposures. What types of instruments they include in the bank's aggregate capital base, how they deal with off-balance sheet activities, and how they handle various reserves and loan loss provisions. The extent to which a bank can expect support under normal or extraordinary circumstances from another member of its group, a cooperative to which it belongs, or from its national or local government, or some supranational organization. The tremendous degree of leverage in banks' capital structures, even taking into account recent increases in core and additional capital, and thus the ease with which adverse economic or financial events can rapidly erode a bank's solvency or liquidity positions. And the speed with which banking practices, accounting and regulatory guidelines, national legislation, and risk management practices have been changing in recent years. Finally, S&P is acutely aware that events in the 2007-2008 financial crisis brought it significant embarrassment and tarnished its reputation, along with that of the other principal credit rating agencies. Whether it is fair to argue that rating agencies performed poorly in failing to anticipate the crisis and the virtual collapse of premier financial institutions around the world is not something we will discuss in this module. But it cannot be doubted that the experience of that financial crisis has concentrated the minds of the rating agencies on a number of risks whose importance they had previously failed to appreciate fully, and has most probably caused them to adopt more conservative criteria for the evaluation of banks' credit risk. Among the consequences of all this, you will see that the S&P methodology for banks is far more technical, detailed, lengthy, and complex than for most other industry groups, and that it requires for its understanding extensive knowledge of principal banking products, risk management techniques, capital structures, funding and liquidity approaches, regulatory frameworks, and many other aspects of the business of banking. One additional consequence of this is that we will necessarily have to simplify some of the guidelines to some degree, and skip some of the subtleties and nuances that you would find if you work your way through them page by page. Nonetheless, we believe this module covers all principal points of the S&P methodology and leaves you able to apply it with reasonable accuracy to any specific bank for which you possess the relevant data. We warn you also that large parts of S&P's criteria are very qualitative in nature and do not lend themselves to precise determinations given how much judgment they involve. And finally, we alert you to the fact that in parts, these guidelines are quite frankly a little dull to listen to, although we have done our utmost to introduce tables and other learning aids to make them more interesting. S&P's approach to the evaluation of banks' credit risk can be found in its publication titled Banks, Rating Methodology and Assumptions, dated November 9, 2001, a link to which is provided in the course outline that you can access by clicking the icon at the bottom left of this video. S&P's approach can be broken down into three broadly separate parts. First, S&P seeks to determine the overall risk of the banking system in which the individual bank is located, without, for the time being, accounting for any specific characteristics of the individual bank. This is referred to as the Banking Industry Country Risk Assessment, or BICRA, and includes a determination of both a so-called economic risk score and an industry risk score. In turn, these are assessed by means of some 10 underlying factors in each case, which range from the country's political risk and economic balances to the competitive dynamics of the financial industry and the regulatory framework under which it operates. We will discuss each of these in great detail in chapters 2 and 3. The result of this first part of the process is to generate a so-called BICRA economic risk score, a BICRA industry risk score, and an overall BICRA group ranking, as you will see in chapters 2 and 3. The BICRA group ranking can be thought of very approximately as the standalone credit assessment of the average bank in the particular jurisdiction, but before including any support uplift the bank is likely to enjoy during extraordinary times, whether from its sovereign or from another member of its group. We stress again that in this part of the process, S&P analyzes relevant economic and industry risk characteristics of the banking and financial system as a whole, but takes no account of the specific attributes of any one institution. In the second part of the ratings process, S&P converts the BICRA scores of the countries in which a bank operates into the bank's so-called anchor standalone credit profile, or anchor SACP. S&P next introduces into its bank-specific analysis the 4 key factors that permit it to determine how much a particular bank can be differentiated from the average bank, as assessed by the BICRA group ranking. These 4 additional factors are business position, capital and earnings, risk position, and funding and liquidity. Given the importance of capital to the assessment of a bank's creditworthiness, we devote an entire chapter, chapter 4, to a detailed exposition of S&P's approach to this matter. This is especially necessary since S&P does not simply incorporate into its analysis a bank's Basel capital ratio and similar metrics, but rather replaces Basel concepts with some of its own, on the basis that measurements under Basel are subject to many differences in national interpretation and are insufficiently conservative in a number of respects. Among other things, you will learn that, perhaps surprisingly, S&P does not determine the capital requirement for a particular exposure by reference to its own rating for that exposure, but uses as the primary driver of this calculation the BICRA group classification, or one of its components, for the country in which the entity or exposure is located. The result of evaluating the individual bank according to the 4 factors we listed immediately above is to permit the transition from the anchor SACP to the final SACP. This can be thought of, again very approximately, as the credit rating of the bank that factors in all specific attributes of the bank itself, as well as of the system in which it operates, but still does not account for any extraordinary support the bank could enjoy during times of unusual stress, whether from its government or from another member of its group. The transition from the anchor SACP to the final SACP is done by notching upward or downward the anchor SACP on account of individual assessments of each of the 4 factors in question. We will illustrate this in great detail throughout Chapter 5, but warn you again that many of these assessments are highly subjective and may generate results you are unable to confirm or with which you may disagree. In the third and final part of this process, S&P examines the likelihood that the bank in question may receive extraordinary support from a third party during stressful times. We will limit our discussion to instances in which the bank is a private sector entity and receives support from its central government. But in fact, S&P also provides guidance on cases in which the bank in question is a government-related entity, or GRE, and also on cases in which the entity providing the support is another member of the bank's group rather than a governmental body. After assessing the systemic importance of the bank in question, the willingness of the government to provide exceptional assistance to the bank, and the domestic credit rating of the government itself, S&P makes the transition from the SACP to the so-called Issuer Credit Rating, or ICR. Again, we will provide comprehensive detail on how all this is done under the methodology, this time in Chapter 6 of the module. The flowchart appearing now, which we have lifted from S&P's published criteria, summarizes the various steps we outlined above and is worth printing and keeping next to you as you watch the rest of this video. Here on the left appears the BICRA methodology, consisting essentially of macro factors and broken down, as we explained earlier, into an economic risk score and an industry risk score. From the combination of these comes the BICRA group score at the bottom left of the chart. The bank's anchor SACP is then determined as a kind of weighted average of the BICRAs, or components thereof, for all principal countries in which the bank operates. In the middle of the flowchart, we now see the bank-specific factors appearing successively, with business position first, then capital and earnings, then risk position, and finally funding and liquidity. All of which combine with the anchor SACP to produce the final standalone credit profile. Finally, S&P incorporates external support, whether in the form of group support or government support, to produce the Issuer Credit Rating, or ICR. The ICR in turn becomes the basis for the bank's senior unsecured rating, although subtleties will arise as to whether we are talking about the foreign currency rating or the domestic currency rating. This completes this chapter 1.